Tag on my wrist said Varunsel female, ornamental, non-viable, no reserve. It had said that for 3 years. I had stopped reading it sometime in the second year. There is only so many times a person can look at the summary of her own ruination before the stop landing and become simply weather. The low gray ceiling that is always there when you look up, neither remarkable nor worth describing. I was not reading the tag. I was watching the door at the far end of holding bay 11 and counting the seconds between the guards' passes, the way I had counted them for 11 months in this particular facility, and the way I had counted them in 3 facilities before this one. 38 seconds. Sometimes 39, if the guard paused to check the opposite bay through the observation glass. He was old and moved like a man whose knees had been through more than they were designed for, and occasionally he stopped at the glass simply to rest his weight on the frame without appearing to rest. I had noted this. I had noted everything in holding bay 11 that could be noted, which is what you do when you are a third-line princess, with no realistic prospect, rescue and a tag that has called you non-viable for 37 months. My name is Aethys Varunsel. I was the 3rd daughter of the 2nd branch of the Varunsel line, which made me 9th in succession to a crown I had never expected to wear and stopped expecting to wear well before the slavers took me. I had been on a transit barge from Soth Station to the diplomatic conclave at Mareth, when the barge was intercepted, which was itself unremarkable. Transit barges carrying minor diplomatic functionaries were intercepted approximately 4 times per standard cycle in the Veth corridor, which was why the Compact had spent 15 years failing to regulate it. What was unremarkable about me specifically was that I had no house fleet to send after me, first-line status to make my recovery politically urgent, and a medical notation from my 4th year that read Varunsel lineage, viable but ornamental, which meant the Compact blood compatibility scan that every royal female underwent at maturity had returned a result too low, primary succession purposes, though still technically within the range for branch recognition. The slavers had read this differently. In the transit markets, ornamental meant decorative. Non-viable was their own addition, their judgment that I was not sellable to the buyers they served, because I was not what those buyers wanted. I had arrived at my first holding facility as a curiosity. I had left it as an administrative problem. By my 3rd facility, I was a line item that kept appearing on inventory rosters without resolving, which is the least dignified position a person of any lineage can occupy. I was watching the door. 38 seconds. The guard's knee paused. 39. 40. He moved on. I lowered my eyes to the floor of my cell and breathed through my nose the way my mother had taught me to breathe. When I was 6 years old and had thrown a political tantrum at a formal breakfast, slow, even. Through the nose. You are a Varunsel, she had said. Not unkindly. Your emotions belong to you. Show me only what you choose to show. I had not thought of that instruction in a long time. I thought of it now because the door at the end of holding bay 11 had just opened at the wrong time. Not the guard's rotation, not a feeding interval, not a client review. And the man who came through it was carrying a data tablet and wearing no weapon I could see. He was human. I knew the species well enough. 2 of the 5 Compact diplomatic missions that had rotated through my mother's court over the years had included human staff. There had been a human archivist at Mareth who had once spent 40 minutes explaining to me the indexing system of a pre-Compact Works repository, as though the subject were genuinely the most interesting thing available for discussion. And I had let him, partly because I was bored, and partly because he was so earnest about it that refusing felt unkind. Humans were not common in the Veth corridor. They were not common in the transit markets. They were not, as a rule, people who appeared in holding facilities at irregular hours carrying data, tablets, and looking around as though they were trying to locate a specific filing cabinet. This one was in his middle years, late 3rd decade by human reckoning, maybe early 4th. He had the kind of face that had been lived in, jaw-carrying old stubble growing toward an actual beard, a scar along one cheekbone that had healed correctly but not cosmetically, dark hair that had been cut practically rather than styled. He wore the gray vest of a Compact documentation officer, which was a designation I recognized from the conclave circuit. Compact documentation sent officers to holding facilities periodically to conduct compliance reviews, roster audits, intake assessments. It was one of the few bureaucratic mechanisms that gave anyone outside the slaver network legal standing to walk through those doors. He looked down at his tablet. He looked up at the row of cells. He looked down again. Then he walked to the intake desk at the near end of the bay, set his tablet on the counter, and began talking to the duty administrator in a voice too low for me to hear from my cell. The duty administrator was a heavy-set Ketheran named Sorvath, who had been running Holding Bay 11 for longer than I had been in it, who conducted every interaction with the detached administrative efficiency of a man who had long since stopped noticing that the items on his registers had names. I watched Sorvath pull up the bay inventory on his terminal and point at something. I watched the human lean over the counter and read it, and then straighten up and say something that made Sorvath's posture shift slightly. Not alarmed, but recalibrated. Then the human picked up his tablet and walked into the bay. He moved methodically, not the way a client moved. Clients moved with a specific kind of proprietary confidence, as though the bay were a showroom and they were shopping, their gaze moving across the cells with the practiced assessment of people who had done this before and were comparing options. This man moved like someone conducting a physical audit of a warehouse. He looked at the cell numbers. He looked at his tablet. He made notes. He moved to the next cell. He had been in the bay perhaps 8 minutes when he reached mine. I was sitting on the bench at the back of the cell. I had been on the back of the cell since I had heard his voice at the intake desk, because I had learned in 37 months that the most useful thing a person in a cell could do when an unknown actor entered the bay was to appear calm, uninteresting, and already accounted for. I had my hands folded in my lap. My posture was correct. My expression was the expression my mother would have recognized. Not blank, not defiant, simply present and composed, giving nothing away that I did not intend to give. He looked at the cell number on the frame above my door. He looked at his tablet. He looked at me. Then he looked at the tag on my wrist. He read it. Not glanced. Read it the way the archivist had read indices, with the specific focused attention of a person who was actually processing information, rather than confirming what he already believed. His expression while reading was neutral and gave me nothing. When he finished, he looked at his tablet again and scrolled to something. He looked back at me. "This says Varun Saul," he said. His voice was unhurried. He was speaking in compact standard, which was appropriate, and at a normal conversational volume, which was not something that happened in holding bays. I said nothing. "Is that your lineage name? Is that a designation code the facility assigned you?" I studied him for a moment. In 37 months, no one had asked me that. No one had asked me anything about the tag that was not directly related to a sales assessment, a medical compatibility check, or an intake verification. The question was so unexpected that I ran it through twice before answering, checking for the angle I was not seeing. "My lineage name," I said. My voice was level. "Aethys Varun Sol, third daughter, second branch." He wrote something on his tablet.
"Third branch, succession, or primary?"
"Second branch. Ninth in succession under the pre-sundering line. Seventh under the revised compact table, if the revision was ratified." I had no idea whether the revision had been ratified. I had been in holding facilities during the entire ratification period. But the knowledge was correct, and I saw no reason not to speak it, because the only power I had left was accurate information, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. He wrote that too. "How long have you been in transit market facilities?" 37 months. This facility, 11 months. The prior facility, 14 months. Before that, 11 months at the Sorav intake station, and the initial 2 months at a way station north of the Kethera corridor, whose formal designation I never learned. The pen, he was using an actual stylus on the tablet, which was unusual, moved steadily. He was a fast writer, and he did not ask me to slow down. "The barge you were taken from. Do you have a record identifier for the incident?" "Transit. Third interval of the current standard year. Barge designation KD7 Southline. En route from Soth Station to the Marith Conclave Diplomatic Assembly. The intercepting vessels bore no registered identifier but used approach protocols consistent with Veth Corridor independent contractors." He looked up from his tablet. It was the first time since he had begun writing that he had looked at my face rather than at his notes, and something in his expression had changed. Not dramatically. Not the way a client's expression changed when an assessment result came back, favorable, but in the specific way that a person's expression changes when the information they are receiving is larger than the form they are trying to fit it into. That conclave was 18 months before your arrival here, he said. By the entry date on this roster. I was at Sorev for 11 months before I was transferred here, I said. I was at the intermediate station for 14 months before Sorev. He looked at his tablet. He did the arithmetic. I watched him do it. That's 37 months, he said. Yes. He wrote for a long moment without speaking. When he stopped, he did not move to the next cell. He stood at the frame of mine and looked at his tablet, and then looked at the tag on my wrist again, and his jaw tightened. Not much, just a fraction. The small involuntary compression of a person who has read something that he has decided is incorrect. Not offensive, not outrageous, simply incorrect in the way that a ledger with a transposed entry is incorrect. A thing that should not be in the record as written and is going to require correction. The tag says non-viable, he said. That notation originated at intake. That notation was added at the first facility. Was told it reflected a client preference assessment. It's not a compact designation code. No, I said. It is not. He wrote that down too. His name, I would learn later, was Kel Morvan. He had spent 11 years in compact freight operations before a back injury had moved him to administrative work, and he had been in compact documentation for 4 years, which meant he had been reviewing transit market compliance rosters for 4 years, and had developed, in that time, a specific and detailed understanding of the difference between a tag that reflected a legitimate compact designation and a tag that a facility had, invented for its own inventory purposes. He was not, he would tell me later with the same unhurried directness he had used in the Bay, political person. He was not a campaigner, or an advocate, or someone with a cause. He was a documentation officer who reviewed rosters. And the roster in front of him contained a notation that was not a valid compact code, attached to a lineage name that appeared in the compact's own pre-sundering royal registry, and those two facts together constituted an error in the record that it was his job to correct. That was how he framed it. An error in the record. I did not learn any of this in the Bay. In the Bay, he finished writing, said, I'll be back in this bay before the end of today's review window, and moved to the next cell. And I sat on my bench and looked at the door and thought about the 38-second rotation and whether I believed him. I had been told things by documentation officers before, not often. Documentation reviews were quarterly at most, and in 14 months at the intermediate facility, there had been no review at all. But often enough that I had developed a working understanding what documentation officers in transit market facilities actually did was create record that the facility was compliant with compact regulations governing the holding of sentient beings with provisional legal status. The record was the point. The sentient being was the subject of the record, not the audience or for it. Officers came through, they noted things, they filed things, and the rosters continued unchanged, except that the facility now had a compliance stamp for another quarter. I did not let myself believe him. I let myself note that he had written my name down, my actual name, spoken by me, recorded by him, in a compact documentation file. That had not happened before. I did not know what it would mean, but a name in a record was harder to erase than a name spoken aloud in a room, and I was third-line royalty trained by a mother who had spent 30 years understanding the political difference between a fact in a record and a fact unrecorded, and I noted it the way I noted the guard's knee and the 40-second pause and the precise time of the irregular door opening. I noted it and I waited. The guard's rotation came and went twice. A feeding interval passed. The low hum of the bay's circulation system continued its even 30-cycle drone. 3 cells down, an older Sothani female who had been in the bay longer than I had, whose name I knew was Varath, and who was, by her own account, a merchant captain, though the tag on her wrist said simply Sothani Female Labor Class Reserve 200, was running her thumb along the seam of her bench the way she did when she was anxious, which she often was, which I understood completely. I did not ask Verith anything. We had an arrangement, she and I, out in the first weeks of our shared occupancy of Holding Bay 11. We did not speak when the duty administrator was on shift. We did not speak during feeding intervals. And when we did speak, we spoke in Varun Sol Old Court. It was close enough to pre-Kampak Sothani that she could follow it, and which the Ketharon administrator could not. We had discussed many things in that language over 11 months. We had discussed the guard's knee and the feeding schedules and the quarterly documentation reviews and the precise body language of clients during assessment walks and how to read the difference between a client who was going to make an offer and a client who was going to leave. We had discussed, once, the Sothini merchant tradition of route keeping, the practice of memorizing a freight corridor's navigational reference points in sequence so that a captain who lost all navigation instruments could still find her way home by the order of the landmarks. Verith had described every landmark on the Sothani mid-corridor route, in sequence, from memory, for approximately an hour one evening, and I had listened to all of it. It had been one of the better hours in 11 months. We had not, for the most part, discussed hope, because hope was a thing that cost more than most of the items available for purchase inside a holding bay, and we were both careful economists. The door at the far end of the bay opened. He was earlier than I had expected, not yet the end of the review window, by my count of the guard rotations. He came in without the duty administrator this time, which was irregular. He was carrying 2 tablets now, one under his arm. He walked straight to my cell. "I need to ask you several more questions," he said. "The answers will be entered into a compact intake assessment record, not the facility roster. That means it's a different system. Do you understand the distinction?" I looked at him. "Yes," I said. "I understand the distinction very well. A compact intake assessment record was not a facility document. It was not administered by the facility, was not accessible to facility staff without compact authorization, and was part of the compact's own archive structure, which meant that whatever went into it was under compact legal protection, not the transit market's informal operating framework. A document in the compact system with my lineage name on it was a document that the compact's own legal division could access. It was the kind of document that, if someone on the other side of it were looking, a member of my mother's court, a diplomatic liaison, anyone who had ever known there was a third daughter in the second branch of the Varun Sol line could be found. "Ask us," I said. He asked for 2 hours. He asked for the full form of my lineage name and every variant of it that would appear in pre-compact registry documentation. He asked for the names of my mother and both parents of the second branch, and their succession numbers, and the date of the most recent Varun Sol succession document I had been present for. He asked about the specific diplomatic conclave I had been en route to, the name of the official who had requested my attendance, the barge operator's registered carrier name. He asked about the interception, the approach vectors, the identification markings I had or had not seen, the number of personnel involved. He asked what had happened at each facility, and he wrote down what I told him, without editorializing and without flinching, which was its own form of respect. Not softening the record, not shaping it toward a finding he had already decided on, simply writing down what I said as I said it. At one point, approximately 40 minutes in, the duty administrator Sorvath opened the bay door and stood in the frame for a moment looking at us. He did not come inside. Kale did not look up from his tablet. I looked at Sorvath with the expression my mother had described, once, as the appropriate face for a Varun Sol, dealing with a person whose objection they were not going to acknowledge, which was simply the absence of acknowledgement, not contempt, not a challenge, simply the face for the person who had noted the interruption and decided it did not require a response. Sorvath stood in the doorway for perhaps 10 seconds and then left. Kale looked up. "He'll do that twice more," he said, as though commenting on a predictable weather pattern. "The third time he'll send a message to the facility's legal contact. By the time that contact replies, we'll be done." He was precisely correct on all 3 counts. The questions continued. He asked about the way station I had been held at initially, the one with no formal designation, and I gave him everything I could reconstruct about it. The approximate location by corridor reference, the physical layout, the number of staff I had observed, the duration. He noted that the absence of formal designation was itself a documentation irregularity and would go into the record as a separate finding. He asked about the conditions at each facility with the same methodical specificity he brought to the lineage questions, not with the expressed sympathy of someone who needed me to know he found it objectionable. Simply with the precision of a person building an accurate record that required accurate details. There was something steadying about that. I had been on the receiving end of various approaches over 37 months. The board assessments of clients who had decided I was not what they needed, the occasional perfunctory check-ins from compact adjacent monitors, who did their work with the visible impatience of people who believed they were attending to a formality, the practical transactions of facility staff who treated the subjects of their administration the way a freight dispatcher treats cargo manifests. Each of those approaches had something in common. The person across from me had a predetermined frame, and they were fitting me into it, or declining to fit me into it, and either way, the frame existed before I spoke and would exist after I finished. Dale Morvain did not have a frame. He had a tablet and a question and a stylus, and he was writing down what I said because it was what I said, and that was the form the record was going to take. It was the most ordinary thing. It felt, in the context of holding Bay 11, something else entirely. Midway through the second hour, I stopped watching his face for the angle I was not seeing and accepted that there was
one.
This was not a technique. He was not building toward a proposition or a threat or a revised offer. He was making a record. He was making a record the way the archivist at Marith had explained the indexing system, with the specific, unself-conscious competence of a person who believed that the work in front of him was worth doing correctly. The conclave official who requested your attendance, he said. Do you have a contact designation for that official within the compact diplomatic registry? Ambassador Seveth Morn, Varanso Liaison, Compact 3rd Diplomatic Circuit, I said. She would have been at the conclave. If the conclave proceeded. The conclave proceeded, he said. I can verify the attendance record, he made a note. She may be listed as having documentation of your transit arrangement. She would have the original invitation. That's enough for a lineage cross-reference, he wrote. One more thing, the non-viable notation on the tag. I'm going to need to formally document that notation is not a compact designation code, and I'd like to include your statement of when it was added, and by whom if you know, I told him. I told him the name of the intake officers at the first facility, the date of the assessment as best I could reconstruct it, the exact wording of the explanation I had been given. He wrote all of it. When he finished, he set the stylus on the tablet and looked at me, not the way he had looked at the tag, not the quick reading scan of someone processing information, directly at my face for a moment. I'm going to file this tonight, he said. The assessment goes into the compact archive through the documentation office, which means it has a timestamp that the facility can't modify. Once it's timestamped, I can open a lineage verification inquiry against the pre-sundering registry, and if the cross-reference confirms, which I think it will, the facility's continued holding of a compact registered royal lineage subject becomes compliance violation. I said nothing for a moment. That process, I said carefully. What is its timeline? Normally, 60 to 90 days for a lineage verification. But a compliance violation attached to an active intake assessment goes to the compact duty advocate desk for expedited review. He paused. 48 to 72 hours if the duty advocate considers it urgent. And whether the duty advocate considers it urgent depends on the duty advocate. He picked up his tablet. The current duty advocate for this sector is an officer named Pallav Sen. She trained as a diplomatic attorney before moving to compliance work. The Varun Sal line is a compact treaty signatory. I expect she'll consider it urgent. I had been in holding facilities for 37 months. I had conducted every conversation in them with the precise portion of myself that I intended to expose, which was the portion that was composed and gave nothing away. I conducted this one the same way, which meant that the thing happening in my chest, the careful, dangerous thing, the thing that cost too much to buy and that I had been a careful economist about, did not show on my face. I understand, I said. He nodded once and moved toward the door. Morvain, I said. He stopped. It was the first time I had used his name. I had read the documentation officer identification on his vest when he was close enough for me to make it out, and I had filed it the way I filed everything. He turned. The intake record, I said. What name is on it? He looked at me. Aethys Varunsol, he said. Third daughter, second branch. I stated. He left. I sat on the bench for a long time after the door closed. 3 cells down, Vareth had stopped running her thumb along the seam and was watching me across the bay in the careful, unreadable way she watched things when she was paying close attention. After the guard's next rotation, when the bay had settled back into its low hum, I said, in Varun's Soul Old Court, there is a documentation officer running a compliance review. She was quiet for a moment, then I heard him ask you questions. He's filing an intake assessment in the compact archive. Another silence. She said, meaning his assessment of the situation, his judgment of the outcome. I don't know, I said. But the record exists now. My name is in a compact document with a timestamp. She was quiet for a long time, then very low. Mine isn't. I thought about that. I thought about it for the rest of the day, and through the night interval, and into the next morning. And when the door opened again at mid-morning and Kyle Morven came through it, he was earlier than the review window again, and he was carrying both tablets. He came to my cell. Then he stopped and looked down the bay at Vareth's cell, and then he looked at his tablet, and then he looked at me. The merchant captain, he said. Cells down, Sothani registry. I looked at him. Her name is Vareth Casson Moore, I said. Registered carrier. Sothani mid-corridor freight circuit, 11 years licensed. She was taken from a layover at Cathara Station 14 months before I arrived here. He looked at his tablet. Then he looked at Vareth's cell, and then at Vareth, who was watching him with the still, evaluating attention of a person who has been in a holding bay long enough to treat strangers as problems to be assessed, before they are treated as anything else. He walked to her cell. I could not hear the conversation clearly from my position, but I watched it. I watched him read her tag. I watched him write. I watched her posture change, not much, the controlled change of a careful person, the specific fraction. That means the person has received information they believe may be true, and are allocating a small portion of themselves to the possibility of it. By the time he finished writing and moved back toward the door, he had visited 4 cells in addition to mine, and the bay was quieter than it usually was after a documentation review. Is to say, it was the kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something people are not yet ready to speak aloud. He filed that night. He told me so the next morning, stopping at my cell for 4 minutes before the review window opened. Pallav Sen flagged it inside 2 hours, he said. He did not appear particularly surprised by this. She's opened a compliance inquiry. Facility has been notified that the compact is reviewing the legal basis of the holding designations for the subjects named in my intake assessment. How many subjects, I said. 6. You, the Sothani captain, and 4 others from the adjacent bays I reviewed yesterday afternoon. He looked at his tablet. The compact duty advocate's notification to the facility requires them to make all 6 subjects available for a status view within 48 hours. 48 hours. I ran that number through twice. 37 months and now 48 hours. What does the status review determine? I said. Whether the compact has grounds to take custody of a subject from a transit market holding facility. He looked up. For a compact registered royal lineage subject held without a valid compliance classification, which is what the non-viable notation issue creates. The grounds are essentially automatic once the lineage verification comes back positive, and if the facility resists. Transit market facilities operate on compact adjacent legal frameworks. They don't have standing to resist a custody transfer once a compliance inquiry is open. They can stall. They can be obstructionist. That's why the duty advocate files for a direct transfer order, not a courtesy request. He closed the tablet cover. Sen has been in compliance work for 12 years. She's filed this kind of order before. The facility knows what it means. I looked at him. You've done this before, I said. He considered the question with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything else. I've filed intake assessments that resulted in status reviews before, he said. Not at this scale. The 6-subject assessment was. The others were one at a time. He paused. The Varun Sol case is the first royal lineage case I've worked. But not the first case. No, he said, not the first case. I thought about that. I thought about a person who had been filing intake assessments in transit market holding facilities for 4 years. Quietly, one at a time, in a job that the compact treated as administrative compliance work, and the facilities treated as a quarterly inconvenience. I thought about what 4 years of that looked like. Not heroic, not dramatic, not the kind of work that produced recognition or commendation, or the things that motivate people who are doing things for the recognition. Just methodical, careful, one form at a time, one name in the record at a time. Morven, I said. Yes. Why? He looked at me for a moment then, without particular drama, because the record was wrong, and it's my job to correct records. It was the most honest answer I had been given by anyone in 37 months. And it was honest in the specific way that things are honest when the person saying them has not thought about the framing, because they have not needed to. When the answer is simply the answer, because the question is not complicated to them. The 48 hours passed. They were not easy hours. The facility's response to the compliance inquiry was precisely what Kale had described. Not resistance, but obstruction. The duty administrator Sorvath became suddenly difficult to locate for the documentation of transfer protocols. The facility's legal representative, compact adjacent attorney, who operated out of a shared office 3 sectors away and appeared to communicate primarily by delayed message relay, raised 3 sequential procedural objections to the status review scheduling, each of which Pallav Sen's office addressed within the hour of receipt. Kale spent most of the 48 hours in the facility's administrative section with his tablets, generating documentation responses. The Bay knew something was happening. I could not explain to the other cells what was occurring in precise terms. Our communication was limited by the arrangement Verath and I had maintained, which did not extend to the other 4 subjects Kale had assessed in the adjacent bays. But the quality of attention in the holding facility had changed in the specific way a room's quality changes when the people in it have been told that the situation they are in may not be as permanent as it appeared yesterday. The feeding intervals seemed the same. The guards' rotation was unchanged. But the hum of the building was different. Or perhaps I was the thing that was different, which amounts to the same observation in terms of what you hear. I know this because he stopped at my cell once each day during the interval, not for a long visit, but long enough to give me a clear and accurate account of where the process stood. The first visit was in the late morning of the first day. The compliance inquiry was open. The facility had been notified. Sorvath had attempted to argue that the intake assessment was outside the scope of a standard documentation review, and Sen's office had responded with the relevant compact statute in 4 hours. The second visit was mid-afternoon of the second day, after the third procedural objection had been filed and dismissed. They're running out of procedure, he said. How many do they have left? 1, possibly 2. But the objections are getting thinner. The first one was a legitimate technical argument about review window jurisdiction. The second was creative. The third was, he stopped. The third was the legal equivalent of asking for more time to do a thing they've already been told they have to do. How long before Sen stops being patient with it? She already has, he said. The dismissal of the third objection included a notation that further procedural delay would be documented as obstruction in the compliance record. He paused. That notation changes what the facility's attorney has to tell them about their options. I looked at him. You're enjoying this, I said. He considered that for a moment with apparent seriousness. I'm finding the documentation work more satisfying than usual, he said. It was the first time in 37 months that I had wanted to smile at something in a holding bay. I did not, because the guard's rotation was in approximately 6 minutes, and I was not going to let a guard see anything on my face that had not been there for 11 months. But I noted it. He told me on the second afternoon that the lineage cross-reference had returned, positive. The compact's pre-sundering registry contained a complete entry for the Varun Sol second branch, including a birth record for the third daughter. The Entry included a diplomatic notation cross-referencing my expected presence at the Marath conclave, and a notation from Ambassador Seveth Morn's office, filed 11 months after the conclave, requesting a trace inquiry on a missing transit subject, which had been filed with the compact and then, apparently, had not been acted on. Trace inquiry was filed, I said. Filed and routed to the Veth Corridor Missing Persons Office, he said, which had a processing backlog of approximately 14 months at the time of filing. I breathed through my nose, even. Slow. Rune's soul breathes through her nose. So it was in the system, I said. It was in the system. And no one. The processing backlog is currently at 19 months, he said in the same level tone. The trace inquiry is still in queue. It has not yet been reviewed. I was quiet for a moment. When this is resolved, I said carefully, that backlog is something someone should address. Yes, he said, it is. He said it the way he said everything, not with the rising inflection of agreement as a social courtesy, but flatly, as a statement of fact. It was the kind of agreement that meant the person intending to say something about it to someone who could act on it. On the third morning, Pallav Sen's office issued the transfer order. I know what I looked like when Kale came to my cell and told me. I know because I have been trained since childhood in what to show and what to keep, and that morning, I showed more than I intended to. Not much, but a fraction that a person shows when a thing they have not permitted themselves to believe has, against the careful accounting of 3 years, turned out to be true. My jaw tightened, my hands, folded in my lap, together harder than they usually pressed. My eyes stayed level, but they were doing something he could see, I think, because he held my gaze for a moment before he spoke, giving me the moment before the information. Transfer order is issued, he said. The facility has to release all 6 subjects by end of the current duty cycle. Compact transit custody will be here in 3 hours. I said nothing for a moment. The door opens, I said. The door opens, he said. There was a beat of silence between us that was not uncomfortable. He was looking at me with the expression he had been carrying since the first day. Steady, present. A face that had been lived in by someone who had done difficult work for a long time. Without needing to be told, the work was important. I was looking at him with whatever I had left to show after 3 years of showing nothing. I'd like to document one thing before the transfer, he said. What thing? I'd like the record to reflect. He stopped and looked down at his tablet and then back up at me. There's a field in the intake assessment for the subject's own account of the period of detainment. Most subjects don't fill it. Most officers don't ask. But it becomes part of the permanent compact archive. He paused. I think it should be filled. I think your account should be in the record. Not just the lineage data and the compliance violations. Your account. I looked at him for a long time. How long do we have? I said. 3 hours. Then we had better start now, I said. We started then. He stood at the cell frame, and I sat on the bench that I had sat on for 11 months. And I told him 37 months, in the order they had occurred, and he wrote all of it. Not the summary, not the compliance-relevant highlights, all of it, the waste station whose name I had never learned, the intake officer who had added non-viable to my tag without explanation, the 14 months at the intermediate facility, and the specific quality of the silence in that place, which was different from the silence here. Thicker, less ventilated. The particular silence of a building that had been designed so that the people inside it could not hear each other clearly, the 11 months in Holding Bay 11. Vareth and the Old Court language, she asked me to explain. And I did, including the route keeping. I told him about the Sothathitrade tradition and the hour Vareth had spent reciting the landmark sequence, and he wrote that too, because I had included it, and his practice was to write what I said. The guard with the bad knee, 38 seconds. He asked, toward the end, whether there was anything I wanted to state directly in the record, not as an account of events, as a direct statement in my own voice to whoever read it. I thought about this. State that the non-viable notation was applied without explanation and without medical or legal basis, I said. State that no documentation officer conducted a compliance review at the intermediate facility during my 14 months there. State that the compact trace inquiry, filed by Ambassador Morn, was in the Veth Corridor, missing persons queue for the entirety of my time in transit. market facilities and did not return a status update during that period. I paused. And state that the Varun Soul Court will be requesting a formal accounting of those facts through the diplomatic registry. He wrote all of it. That's a formal diplomatic notification, he said when he finished. Yes, I said. It is, I have that standing, even from this bench. He looked at me for a moment. I'll mark it as a formal notation from a compact treaty signatory representative, he said. That categorizes it differently in the archive. It goes to a separate compliance tier. Good, I said. He wrote that too. When he finished, he set the stylus on the tablet and looked at me. Not the way he had looked at the tag. Not the quick reading scan of someone processing information. Directly at my face for a moment. The record is as complete as I can make it, he said. The record is complete, I said. When Compact Transit Custody arrived, 2 officers in Compact Gray, a documentation supervisor, and a transit advocate from Pallav Sen's office. Kale filed the intake assessment from his tablet, while the transit advocate was reviewing the transfer order with Sorvath, who had managed to locate himself for this portion of the proceedings. The timestamp registered in the compact archive at exactly the moment I heard the cell lock disengage. The door opened inward. That detail surprised me, 11 months, and I had never considered which direction it opened. Inward, toward me, I stood. My legs were steady. I had kept myself in reasonable physical condition, for the same reason I had kept counting seconds and noting details, because the maintenance of physical capacity is a precondition of all other agency, and I was not going to let go of it. I stood without needing to hold the wall, and I walked to the door and through it, and the floor of the corridor outside my cell felt different under my feet than the floor inside it felt, though they appeared to be the same material. It was a small and probably meaningless distinction. I noted it. I noted also that the corridor smelled different. Not better, necessarily. It smelled of the same facility air, and the same ventilation, and the same recycled station atmosphere that all enclosed spaces in this part of the corridor shared. It was the air of a corridor that did not belong to my cell. And that difference was registered by a part of me that was not thinking about it, because that part had been waiting for 11 months and did not need instruction to recognize the change. Kale was standing to the side of the cell frame, clear of the transit personnel, his tablet folded under his arm. He was not part of the transit process. He had completed his documentation role. He was present, I understood, simply because he had been in the bay for 3 hours, and the transfer had occurred while he was here, and it had not seemed like the moment to leave. I stopped in front of him. He looked at me the way he had looked at me every time, directly, without the overlay of assessment or negotiation or anything except the specific quality of attention that a person gives when they are looking at a person rather than a category. The record is complete, I said. The record is complete, he said. I looked at him for a moment, then, Morvain, when you write up the compliance report on this facility, and I assume you will, because you're going to be very thorough about it, include the processing backlog on the Veth Corridor missing persons trace inquiries. Include it by name. Include the 19-month figure. Make it a finding, not a footnote. Something in his jaw shifted. Not much. I'll make it a finding, he said. Thank you. The transit advocate was waiting. I turned toward the corridor. Behind me, 3 cells down, I heard the second lock disengage. Verith's cell, opening. I heard her step into the corridor and stop. I heard the same quality of silence from her direction that I recognized from my own moment. The silence of a person on the other side of a door that has finally opened, taking the first breath of unrestricted air, and not yet knowing what to do with it. Then I heard her take 1 step, and then another, and her footsteps in the corridor had a quality that Verith's footsteps in a cell did not. The flat, even authority of a merchant captain who has walked the deck of her own ship and knows what it is to move through a space on her own terms. I did not turn back. She did not need me to turn back. We had discussed this in Old Court, in fragments over 11 months, the hypothetical of a day when the bay opened. We had discussed it carefully because we were careful economists. We had agreed, without stating it directly, that when the day came we would walk, not run, not collapse, walk. Because that was the kind of people we were, and the bay had not changed that. I turned back once. Kale was making a note on his tablet. He did not look up immediately. When he did, I held his gaze for one moment longer than the situation required. "Your name is in the compact record," I said. "Cale Morvain, Documentation Officer, PAPT Documentation Division, Veth Corridor Sector. Filed under Intake Assessment, Royal Lineage Subject, Varun Sol 2nd Branch, full account. You'll be in the compact archive for a long time." He looked at me steadily. "So will yours," he said. I walked out of Holding Bay 11. The corridor was wider than I remembered corridors being, though I had been in this particular corridor before for facility transit. Lights in it were overhead and even, and did not have the particular quality of the cell's recessed panels. They were simply lights in a ceiling, the ordinary lights of a building being used for its intended purpose. And they fell on me, the way ordinary light falls on a person who is where they supposed to be. I walked toward the transit checkpoint at the end of the corridor, and Vareth walked 3 paces behind me, and the transit advocate walked 2 paces ahead. And the 2 transit custody officers maintained their professional flanking position, and the corridor was 47 steps long, which I knew because I counted. I counted everything. That was the habit. You count what you can count. You know what you can know. You keep the record accurate. My name was in the compact archive, Ethis Vershun Sol, 3rd daughter, 2nd branch. Account of detainment, full text. Filed by Cale Morvain, Documentation Officer. Timestamp registered in the hour of the transfer. Pallav Sen's office would process the compliance violations within the standard 60-day window, and the facility would receive a formal sanction and a corrective measures requirement. Trace inquiry in the Veth Corridor missing persons queue would eventually reach my entry and return a status. Located. Transferred to compact custody. Lineage confirmed. Case closed. Ambassador Camoran's office would receive the notification and would contact the Varun Sol Court, which would notify my mother, which I did not permit myself to think about too concretely, because I was in a corridor with 47 steps and I needed to walk them steadily. The processing backlog would be included as a finding in the compliance report, not a footnote. Cale had said he would make it a finding, and in 3 days of knowing him, I had developed a precise working understanding of what it meant when he said he would do something. I had also, somewhere in those 3 days, arrived at a precise working understanding of what it meant that he had been doing this work for 4 years. Not this case. This case was one case. 4 years meant other cases, other holding facilities, other rosters with notations that were not valid compact codes, other names and systems that the systems had decided to treat as inventory items rather than as names. He had said it plainly, not the first case. He had said it in the same tone he used for all the other plain facts, the way. Station's missing designation was a documentation irregularity. The trace inquiry had a 19-month backlog. Third procedural objection was the legal equivalent of asking for more time to do a thing they already had to do. Facts, noted, written down. 4 years of writing things down that needed to be written. I thought about what that looked like from the outside. A documentation officer in the Veth Corridor filing compliance assessments, one at a time, in facilities that treated the work as a quarterly inconvenience. I thought about the specific kind of patience required to do that work, without the recognition that comes with dramatic gestures, without the visibility of a rescue operation, or a military intervention, or a diplomatic confrontation. The record was the whole of it. The record, and the next facility, and the next roster, with the next irregularity, and the next name that needed to be written down correctly. It was the least remarkable thing. It was also, in any precise accounting of what had happened over 37 months, the only thing that had mattered. I reached the transit checkpoint. The advocate presented the transfer documentation to the checkpoint officer. The checkpoint officer scanned it, looked at me, looked at the documentation, and cleared the transfer, stepped through the checkpoint and out of the facility's legal jurisdiction and into the complex. Outside the facility entrance, an actual outside, a station concourse, the ordinary noise and movement of a place that people passed through, voluntarily, going from one destination to another. I stopped for a moment. Not because I needed to stop, because I had not stood in an unconstrained public space in 37 months, and the first sensation of it was large enough that it seemed worth acknowledging before I moved through it. There were people in the concourse, going about the ordinary work of being somewhere. A Catherine freight coordinator was talking into a comm unit near a cargo gate, gesturing with her free hand at something behind her. Two young humans in compact courier gray were moving quickly toward a transit door, one of them consulting a route map on a small display, both of them unaware of anything except the route in front of them. An older Sothani male was sitting on a station bench, reading something on a flat reader, and the reader was tilted slightly toward the light from the overhead panels, the way a person tilts a reader when they have been reading for a long time and have made themselves comfortable. They were going places. They were reading things. They were conducting the ordinary operations of people in a place they had arrived at by choice and would leave by choice, and none of them would think anything remarkable about any of this because it was not remarkable to them. It was, in that moment to me, the transit advocate was speaking about temporary housing arrangements and the schedule for the lineage verification formal hearing and the timeline, contact with Ambassador Morin's office. I listened to all of it. I would remember all of it. I was a Varun Saul and I kept the record accurate. For that one moment, I stood in the station concourse and felt the size of the space around me, the high ceiling, the movement in all directions, the air moving in a way that was not the 30-cycle hum of a ventilation system, but simply air, and I breathed through my nose, slow, even. My mother's instruction, held for a long time in the specific place where I kept the things that were mine. A month later, I received a message through the compact diplomatic relay. It was brief, which was not the style of the Varun Sol court on formal matters. It was addressed to me in the full form of my name, and it came from an account I recognized as belonging to Ambassador Morin's office. It said, "Your intake record has been entered into the Varun Sol court archive. Your account of detainment is on file. The documentation officer's name is on file with it. Your family has been notified." I read it twice. Then I composed a reply and sent it. I sent it through the standard compact documentation relay, addressed to Kale Morvain, documentation officer, Veth Corridor Sector. The message said, processing backlog finding was noted in the court brief. The Varun Sol diplomatic liaison has formally requested a compact audit of Veth Corridor, missing persons processing capacity. This is not an informal request. I want you to know it is in the record. Also, the record is complete. It has been complete since the moment you wrote my name in it. I have not stopped knowing that. His reply came 3 days later. It was short, which I had expected. It said, "The audit request came through the documentation office this morning. Pallav Sen has assigned it to the active compliance review. It will be addressed." Good. The record was complete. I had walked out of holding bay 11 in the ordinary way. A person walks through a door. One step and then the next. The same way I had maintained my physical condition and counted the guards' rotations and kept the record accurate, because the maintenance of capacity and record are the things that a person keeps when everything else is taken, and they are the things that are given back. Sometimes, when the door opens and a person who has decided to do his job correctly is standing on the other side of the frame. His name was in the archive, Kale Morvain, documentation officer. The man who had asked my name when the manifest called me unsellable. That was 37 months, and then 48 hours, and then a door. I noted it. I kept it in the record. Aethys Varun Sol keeps the record accurate.